years ago today, 11 Israeli athletes were killed at the Summer Olympics in Munich after being taken hostage by members of the militant Palestinian group Black September. The massacre on 5th September 1972 is one of the darkest chapters in Olympic history.
This is a CBS News special report. Terror at the Olympics with CBS News correspondent Morton Dean.
The story from Munich, Germany today was a tale of two cities. Munich, the site of the 20th Olympic Games, aggressive but peaceful competition between individuals, between nations, but the terror of what might be called the real world intervened. The games suspended, at least for the time being. Arab guerrillas had invaded the male athletes' housing area, killed 2 Israelis in the pre-dawn raid, claimed 8 hostages, and later, at a military airport, as the scene shifted, the other 8 hostages died.
Well, that audio is from CBS News back in 1972. All of the hostages died either during the initial raid on their sleeping quarters or else killed during a firefight with German police at a nearby airfield as the hostage takers tried to spirit the survivors out of the country. Well, among those with the clearest view of that day's events were New Zealand athletes housed 50 metres away. Earlier, I spoke with one of them, the long-distance runner Rod Dixon. He says it feels like it was just a few days ago.
We had been out, naturally, in Munich. You go to the beer hall and have a bit of social gathering. And we'd come back and we were milling around, as you would, before talking and chatting. And then we heard like a pop, pop, pop. And I said to Dick Taylor, I said, that's kind of weird. That sounds kind of like somebody practicing with their gun or something. And he said, oh, it's probably the pentathlete athletes. And so that was, we couldn't figure it out. Then in the morning, I went out onto the balcony and the New Zealand team were right next to the Israelis. And we went out on the balcony and I said, you've got to look at this. There's someone on the balcony with a balaclava and a machine gun. And we sort of thought, what is going on? And then about 5-10 minutes later, knock on the door and get your passports and you have to evacuate.
So when you saw the person in the balaclava, what did you do?
Well, I wondered what it was all about, whether there was a game going on or something. We didn't. See, at that point, the young fella from New Zealand, we were in the Olympics. We were like in Wonderland. We never imagined anything negative. It was always very, very exciting and very positive and uplifting. And so that you never, ever cast your mind back over the other side of the fence to something that might be going on. And suddenly, obviously, once we were evacuated out to the main entrance area, we were advised of what was going on. And it was just, shock horror.
In that initial sighting in the morning, did you put it together with what had happened the night before with that pop, 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 as you talked about?
Well, yeah, that's what it was. We once we started to understand what was going on, helicopters were hovering around, armored trucks and army vehicles were going underneath the village, and that's when we started to realise that something's going on at the Israelis. And then we learned that the terrorists had dressed up as athletes. They came into the area. They managed to get in through a fence. And then, of course, they were walking through the village looking like athletes. And that's where they made their way to the Israeli headquarters or their facilities. And that's when they went in there. And, of course, as we know now, a couple of the athletes barred the door. And that's when they shot through the door and killed them. And then they rounded up the others. And that's when the standoff started to come. And terrorists had said that you've got to release these or else we're going to blow the village up. Mm. And that's why we were moved out, because we were right next door.
How well did you know the Israeli athletes who were targeted?
We would often, breakfast, lunch and dinner. We would say hello, we would talk, and sometimes we would walk with them. In fact, they had a couple of competitive walkers, and the way they even walked to breakfast was And so I remember Dick Taylor and I would see if we can keep up with them. And of course, we would try to keep up with them, and they'd say, "How do you walk so fast just when you're going to breakfast?" And so there was a little bit of dialogue, and then sometimes we would have a coffee with them, and so there was always that friendly. It was the friendly games. It was happy. It was so you got to know people, and so it was a very, very emotional time when we heard that they had all been now taken out of the village, and they were being taken to the airport. And then, of course, as it progressed, we heard that there was a full massacre. Yeah,
it must have been a huge shock finding out what had happened. But then you carried on, didn't you, with the games?
The games were then suspended as part of all this, and Avery Brundage, who is the IOC president, he actually suggested that the games be cancelled. And when we heard about that, that was shock. But then the Israelis stepped up and said, "No, you do not. We are subject to this every day of our lives. And the games must go on in the memory and respect to those athletes who have been killed." And we New Zealanders, we all felt this was much more positive, that now we were out there in their memory. And I think that's during the ceremony at the stadium for the Israelis. It was announced that by the Israeli president of their Olympic committee. He said the games must go on in the honour and respect to those athletes who gave their lives for their country and for sport.